like first to thank the Catholic University here in Lviv for this invitation. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. It's a great pleasure to be also part for the second time in this Catholic University partnership. Very pleased to see an old friend and face that we met 4 years ago, actually, in Rome. And at that time, indeed, as Sophia has mentioned, I was the director of education at the Council of Europe, and the main topic of this session actually was to look at how the Charter for Education for Democratic Citizenship and Participation that was elaborated or adopted by the Council of Europe could be translated into reality by Catholic universities. So that was in a way a golden age just 4 years ago, where we were looking at broad principle in terms of education to promote the European ideals. And so what went wrong in having just 4 years later as a main topic, this big concern, fear, or threat about the rise of populism and the rise of nationalism. And as I said, I'm also very pleased to be here, because here I came also here 4 years ago, and thanks to Volodymyr, and I'm very impressed to see all those development in just 4 years, the construction of new buildings and the expansion of this university that really demonstrates the vibrant engagement here in Lviv. As Sophia has mentioned, and I'm not here to make the promotion of my book, because it was 10 years ago and has been sold out since then. But I learned a great deal when I produced this book, and I was not actually expecting that. The principle was very simple, and it was collecting maps from Europe, and I've asked about 80 people from around the world, about 40 from Europe and 40 from outside Europe, to share their vision about what Europe means really to them. Not the EU Brussels bureaucracy, but I asked them, what does it mean for you from your own perspective? And I asked a very wide and diverse spectrum of people, from Ban Ki-moon, Secretary General of the UN, to Daniel Barenboim, the music conductor, and the Secretary General of the League of Arab States, and scientists, and whoever, an artist. Half of them from Europe, half of them from outside Europe. That was a decision that I made with my publisher. And it was interesting to see when I started receiving the feedback that there was two set of tones. Those people, the people who I asked from Europe, what is your vision about Europe, were very negative or very critical or very kind of spoiled kids attitude, if I can say. And interestingly, all the people I asked from Africa, from China, from South Asia, from the Middle East, from the United States, they said, wow, it's amazing how big you have achieved, or how big Europe has been doing in just 40 or 50 years. That was 10 years ago. I published this book to celebrate at the occasion of the 20th anniversary of the collapse of the Berlin Wall, because my two daughters were born just around those dates, and I realized that this generation had no idea of what has been Europe before, and so I wanted to have some sort of a testimony. And it was interesting. I mean, it really struck me to see that people from Africa, people from Asia, people from the Middle East said, well, it's amazing how much, in terms of peace, in terms of stability, in terms of prosperity, in terms of personal accomplishment, human values, human dignity, Europe has been the engine and the promoter. But none of the Europeans mentioned that. So it was really for me a great lesson, and I really realized that there was a huge, actually, or there is still more than ever, a huge need to explain, to share the European project, because obviously people in Europe have no idea of how much has been accomplished and is still accomplished, even so there is lots of mistakes and like for any public project, but still there is a terrible gap in terms of information, communication, explanation, pedagogy. And I think this is something that really needs to be addressed in response to the rise of populism, and also in order to develop some sort of a European consciousness. There is no way to expect to have a European consciousness when people have no idea of what the project is about. So I will develop, I mean, very briefly, I mean, and I will take privilege of not being an academic to just to go through kind of general consideration. And my 3 points will revolve around 3R: resilience, reset, and responsibility. Resilience, as we said this morning, and I think Europe went during the past 5 to 10 years through the most challenging and the most, in a way, disruptive events or circumstances. We know with the economic and financial crisis, with the Migrants Crisis, when during 2 or 3 years, every single European watching TV or the media, the news on TV was seeing those flows of thousands or hundreds of thousands of migrants who were, in a way, invading Europe, and the feeling of a terrible threat. And we went through this terrible situation of terrorists that really targeted almost every single country in Europe, and was, in a way, the culminating point also of the Brexit. And so, in a way, you know, this could have been enough, you know, really to shut down or to the whole European project. And even so, you know, we went through the most challenging or the most destructive situation. Europe is still here. It is still strong, even so it is really in difficulty. But still, it remains still an economic and a trade superpower. It is still a driving force on global negotiation. If you take, for instance, the whole discourse or the whole process of the climate change regulation with the recent Paris Agreement, this was really led by the European countries and the European diplomacy. Europe has been very strong, for instance, in adopting this new regulation that is something extremely important that will enter into force, I think, next week with the, it's a jargon, you know, the GDRP, the Global Regulation on Data Protection, which is a radical change. And for the first time ever, in a way, Europe is developing a regulation that will apply to even companies and countries beyond the European territory. And this is, in a way, a response to, you know, to the business of data from around the world. And Europe is still living with the highest standards of living. So there is a strong resilience, and I think it is important to, I mean, to keep that in mind. This leads me to the second R, which is the reset. And it's not because Europe has been resilient, and it's not because Europe is still strong economically and even sometimes diplomatically, that there is not a need for a profound reset and a profound reflection of what the project is about in order indeed to develop this European consciousness. And I think that all those recent crises, you know, contributed to the rise of a profound skepticism, a profound angriness against the European project, and also a situation of fear. And nothing is worse than fear. So there is really a need to address this. And also because for the first time ever, if we look at this long journey, you know, since the adoption, let's say, of the Rome Treaty in March '57, so 60 years of existence. Even so, there has always been people or groups or organizations to be very critical. The essence of the European project has never been really put into question, even by the most radical critics of the European project, because there were two fundamentals that Europe has been achieved according to the global opinion. One, it has contributed to peace, 60 years of peace, which was for the first time ever on this continent. And secondly, even the most critical voice agreed or acknowledged that Europe has been promoting economic and social prosperity. So those two pillars were, in a way, some sort of a consensus. Then there were lots of people criticizing for this or that reasons, but there was no real questioning about the very essence or the very raison d'être of the European project. And this is what we see now growing in some parts of Europe, and this is also what was expressed in a way with the Brexit, which shows that we are very close to, in a way, to the collapse, and therefore the need for a very profound rethinking about what the European project is about. Because this narrative that worked for my generation or generation of a few of us here, this narrative about peace and prosperity is no longer enough for a new generation and also for many other people to say, okay, well, this is no longer the truth, you know, because it is obviously no longer promoting prosperity, and we don't see much peace. We see lots of crises, we see the terrorism, we see lots of insecurity. And so Europe, which was supposed to protect us against those major threats, is no longer protecting us. And therefore, there is a vacuum, or there is a lack of justification or raison d'être of the European project. And you cannot expect to develop a European consciousness, or you cannot expect to have people supporting more cooperation or more solidarity among Europeans if they don't share a minimum of core values, or if they don't share a sense of a common views or common horizon. And I think this is the time has come now to reinvent or reconsider, or that's why I call that the reset, a new narrative that will bring Europeans together, and obviously, you know, we will be always together, you know, for cultural reason, historical reason, religious reason, whatever, but we have to demonstrate to Europeans that even so they are different, they have 80%, 90% of their core values in common, or if not the core values, eventually some sort of a global perspective that they want to develop together. And those values, I mean, it's not the time now to define those values, but there are obviously, I mean, if we look at the rule of law, if we look at diversity, if we look at the climate change objective or gender equality or whatever, we have a lot in common. The debate is not just about Europe. I think it's important also to keep that in mind. The debate is also a growing fear in our part of the world, in obviously the Western world, that in a way has lost its kind of superpower, and we have been going through different phases during the past, let's say, since the collapse of the Berlin Wall. You know, we went from, I mean, a bipolar world that prevailed during the Cold War to a let's say the end of what was called the end of history, and a unipolar world, and then a multipolar world. And today we are, in a way, in sort of a no-one's world, where you know, the rising countries are not at the top, the declining countries are not at the bottom, and so we have lots of forces which are more or less equal. And there is a profound sense, of course, in Europe, but in the Western world, that we represent a shrinking part of the population, we represent a shrinking part of the economy, we represent a shrinking part or shrinking influence in terms of diplomacy, and people need to learn, or people have to be told by their leaders that indeed the world has changed, and that we will never get back to the previous world. I mean, this is it is very important to realize and that people understand that we are entering a new world where the Brazilian philosopher was calling the Western fundamentalism, where all the values that were supposed to prevail all around the world, being in China or in Africa, had to be the Western values. And there is still, this big debate about to what extent the so-called universal principle. And as I said, I spent 7 years with the UN, so I should not question the UN declaration. But it's important to have in mind that the UN declaration was adopted by 48 countries, which were representing, for many of them, their own territories or their own colony. And so it's important to realize and to acknowledge that the world is radically changing, and that what we used to see as let's say the rise of the BRICS, the Brazil and Russia and others, which was seen, or which is still seen by many observers, as an economic phenomenon. It is not just an economic phenomenon. The BRICS are willing, of course, because they play now a major economic role, they also want to have a seat at the table when it comes to discuss the fundamental values and the way we live together, and what are indeed the principle in living together on the same planet. And so I think it is important that Europeans, and this is also what eventually could contribute to a certain sense of European consciousness, would understand that there is a need to have, if we want to have a peaceful world where rules and regulation would be fair and adopted and approved by all, that we would also accept to open our eyes and our ears to the views and expectation of other culture, other tradition. Even so, we sometimes disagree with it. And but I think the real challenge today or tomorrow is eventually to create a system or mechanism on at least where we would agree on how to disagree. And if we agree on how to disagree, we will already make a big progress. So this need for the reset, I think, is very urgent. It requires also the capacity to be modest and indeed to listen and also to acknowledge that we have made mistake. And I think that one of the mistake, and I know that this is a bit taboo here, is, for instance, the way the relationship has been handled in the 90s with Russia in the post collapse of the Soviet Union. I think there was lots of arrogance from Europe and the Western world to say, we have been the winners and they have just, to come to us, and not listening or not trying to create the condition for living decently together, or at least in peace and respect. So I think we are, in a way, Europe has made mistakes, and I think, we can learn a great deal from our mistakes, and this is what can also contribute to this reset and to create values that we will be sharing together. My last point, because I think I must be on time or close to my time, is the third R, which is responsibility. If we really want to do this reset, to create those new values, or to create some sort of a new European compact or contract, I see three major responsible force. One, of course, is education. Education against obscurantism and against ignorance. And I think in this respect, this gathering and the role of a Catholic university is immensely important to look at how we can bring different perspective and how to develop this critical spirit, but also to understand and to explain better the new dynamics of the world. If we really look at how fast and how speed is the wind of change, in technology, in business, in so many activities, but still we see in most countries the lack of reform, or the lack of adaptation of the education system to the global perspective. And I think there is a tremendous need to develop the tools, to develop the spirit, to develop the efforts to promote an education system that will explain, for instance, history, society in a different way that will be more open to the new realities. That's one thing. The second thing, or the second R, the second responsibility, is very much about leadership. I think what is really needed today is, and there is obviously a lack of political leadership in Europe. I remember when I was in my 20s and very involved in European project, there were at least a dozen of major leaders in Europe who were the advocate and who were very strong voice, very well respected voices that were speaking and advocating for Europe. Today, and that's with the exception, I would say, and it's quite new that, with the French president, who is really going all around the world and all around Europe and really to keep the flame of the European project. There is a very serious issue, and if nobody is speaking for Europe, it will be very difficult to generate the public support. The third responsible or the force, to promote a new project, or the reset, is how the information about Europe is spread around. I think Europe has always been seen and is still seen as a kind of an elite club or exclusive club for people who understand the very sophisticated discussion about the EU policy, the trade policy, the financial policy, and so on and so forth. And I think there is a real need to radically and profoundly change the way people are invited to engage or to enter the European project. And we are very, very far from that. And I see, for instance, and I really very much regret that so we will have next year, as you know, the European election, so the election for the European Parliament, which will be immensely important, because if we take the current political situation, we could have a European Parliament next year that will be very largely dominated by the populist representative, which would be very, very, in a way, very bad for the European project. And so a few European leaders have been launching a few weeks ago what were supposed to be a very large popular consultation about the European project, actually what we just mentioned in this reset. And I see the way it is organized. It is, as usual, some sort of a very small group of the converted who discussed among themselves instead of really trying to reach out to the people about basic and simple message about the European project, which, because it remains in the end an extraordinary project, and I really believe that it deserves, to be better supported. Thank you.